Episode 7 of Fargo Season 5 is here, and it's safe to say that this was a workout on the mind. What we thought was reality turned out to be extremely far from what actually occurred, at least with Dot's screen time. There were some Fargo movie Easter eggs embedded within this episode, some No Country for Old Men, and an ending which has left Dot in a situation where the Puppet Master has now returned. So let's jump into this episode and break down all that there was to take away from it. Here is Fargo Season 5 Episode 7 Ending Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Ole Munch's connection to the movie. Within this episode, we saw the woman that he was staying with had her son arrive home, and we saw the way that he treated her. He scrounged off her, was abusive in the way that he spoke, and was essentially ordering her around. Once Ole heard this, we saw him go downstairs where he said how he was able to stay in the home with her because they were doing a trade, and it meant that no cash payment was required for him to be able to stay there. This was something that the son wasn't happy with, and we saw that he took some money off of Ole, a wad of cash which he demanded needed to be paid in full every month. From there, the son was leaving, and this was where we saw Ole walk out into the front yard, pick up an axe and kill her son with it. This is a moment which is symbolic of the scene in the 1996 movie within the climax, where Carl was killed. What made this even more poignant and paid homage to the movie even more was that the encounter in the feature was Carl dishing out money and keeping more for himself after burying the $1 million in a place that only he would be able to find. Oh, and also about that, didn't it look like the road that Dorothy was driving down was the one that the money was buried in during the movie? It really did remind me of it. So this was something which definitely paid tribute to the movie as it's such an iconic scene. Whilst we never heard about what the trade was, I think the trade was that Ole was able to live there if he killed the woman's son, something which it felt like she wanted as she seemed to be sick of him and his abusive ways. Hence why Ole went outside immediately after and killed him. Plus it also didn't seem like she cared that much about the fact that her son was dead. So the opening scene most definitely gave us feels of the movie whilst developing the story forward. Was Dorothy daydreaming? One thing that was particularly interesting about this episode is that most of what we saw from the perspective of Dorothy was something which was made up and inside of her head. 2 episodes back, she mentioned how she had to go and do something before getting in the car with the dealership plates, which was also another Easter egg to the movie because they were the plates that Carl had on his car. And from there, we saw that after she sat down inside of a diner, everything that happened, well, it just didn't. It was all inside of her mind. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't important to the show. Within this part of the episode, there were a few different hints that it could have been inside of her head and that it wasn't actually real. For example, she was dozing off as she was driving, showing that she was on the cusp of blacking out. On the radio within the car, the song I'm Your Puppet began to play. There was a Camp Utopia postcard in the entrance of the diner. She saw a flyer with chicken piccata on in the diner, the meal that everybody was eating at the refuge. So all of the things that we saw in the build-up to Dorothy blacking out were hidden, but were also in plain sight, and it showed that her subconscious was just piecing them all together when she was in the state of being asleep. This episode really leaned in on the abuse that Dorothy went through when she was Nadine, and the fear that was instilled within her after everything that Roy did to her. She almost blamed Linda, the missing wife that we knew nothing about until this episode, for roping her into the situation that she was in. As during the story, we saw that Linda found her at the supermarket stealing and stuck up for her to the manager and brought her back home. And it was here when Nadine felt that Linda used her as a distraction for Roy so that she could take some of the abuse away from herself and instead devise a plan to escape. Something which during the puppet show we heard that Roy said to Nadine that Linda just packed her bags and then upped and left during that time. I however don't think that's the case. I think that Roy killed Linda and she's buried somewhere. This was a story that came from Roy Tillman's mouth to Nadine. Plus, we also saw during the puppet show just how much he hurt Linda and abused her. So I think maybe one night he took it too far, and whether it be by accident or not, he killed her. And that was the story that he was just telling everybody to make out like nothing bad had actually happened. This was the story that Nadine told herself because that's what she felt happened. We must remember as well, when Linda left, Nadine was only a child. So it might just be a story that she believed because she knew no different. But the fact that Linda hasn't actually reached out in reality, it makes me think that she's no longer around. Puppets were used as the main method of telling the story because it was symbolic of the women being the puppet masters and having a voice in telling their stories, rather than being the puppet in an abusive relationship. So it switches the power, which is the reason that I felt like it was done that way. The whole puppet show was about Nadine trying to convince Linda to go with her to the police so that she could back her up in confirming that Roy was abusive towards her. And when Linda decided to, we saw that whilst in the car, the episode cut back to reality, and Dorothy was still just sitting in the diner, showing that all of this happened inside of her head. But it was her way of being able to remind herself of the trauma that she'd been through, something that it felt like she hadn't really addressed in a long while. It was after this that she stepped outside and was hit by a truck colliding with a car, and she woke up in hospital where Roy was claiming to be her husband, and he locked himself in the room with her. So it very much feels like he's going to get what he wants in being able to take her back to the ranch if she goes along with it, because she'll most likely be scared of him. So the situation is definitely at its fiercest and scariest that it's been for the character since the season began. Gator has opened up a can of worms. During this episode, we saw that Gator was using his tracker from No Country for Old Men to find Ole Munch and get the revenge that he planned on getting in the previous episode for all of the deaths that Ole had caused to people that he cared about. As the tracker was going off, he saw the silhouette of what looked like Ole on a rocking chair, and this caused Gator to fire at it, thinking that it was who he wanted to kill. However, it wasn't the case. It was the body of the son that Ole killed in the opening part of the episode, and he was rocking him from a distance. After this, Gator retrieved the tracker from underneath Ole's car, and he saw that the bag of money that Roy gave him was in the back seat, so he broke the window and went to take it. However, he was interrupted by the woman that Ole was staying with, calling him a thief and trying to stop him, something which resulted in her death as Gator pushed her and she hit her head on the curbside. This is something that's definitely going to come back to bite Gator. Not only did he try to kill Ole, but he killed the person that was doing him a favor, and he seemed to have grown fond of, as we saw with the reaction that Ole gave. This makes me think that even though Roy and Ole put their issues behind them, we're now going to be seeing Ole going after Gator and Roy in order to seek revenge for what he did in this episode, reigniting the trouble that Roy wanted to avoid. Overall review. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't really a big fan of this episode to start with, but the longer it went on, the more I was impressed by the stylistic choices that were made and the twist that occurred at the end. I thought the use of puppets was a great touch, and when going back and rewatching it, all of the subtle details that Dorothy's subconscious picked up to piece together her story was great to spot. We've only got 3 episodes left of the season, and I am wondering where the show is going to go. I said at the start, this show needs all 10 episodes to tell the story, and it feels like that even now. I'm intrigued to see where it's going to go and what's going to happen next. We've still got everything going on with Indira and also the rain, but I think that will get picked up again next week. This was almost like a breather episode where we got the intimate time with the main character that we needed. I thought Juno Temple was great as Dorothy in this episode. It was her best performance to date as we saw such emotion from her, even in the slightest of facial expressions, so I commend her for that. So, there you have it, Fargo Season 5 Episode 7 Ending Explained. If you want to see more videos on Fargo Season 5, then click on the card in the top corner, or alternatively you can head over to my channel where you'll find a playlist of them all. And finally, if you'd like to see what I rate the latest movies that don't quite make the cut to getting a dedicated video, then head over to my Letterboxd profile. I've rated Fargo over there and left a review too, so if you want to see that, then head there. What did you think of this episode? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.